this weekend, as I was putting up IKEA furniture and thinking about today, I thought, you know what? Let's just talk about something that I know of, which is a chapter that I wrote for a book that we just published around transformations. So how do we transform data? Since it's the thing that I do most. And as I was also working with IKEA furniture at the moment, I thought, wow, actually, the best transformation pipelines are those that are engineered like IKEA furniture. And I thought, well, that's an original idea to bring to Juan's podcast.
Okay, I'm excited. I
Yeah.
can already imagine where this is going. Let's start by the basics. What exactly do you mean by transforming data? Even though that should sound like familiar to most people listening.
So what I mean by transforming data is you have raw data that you've just maybe ingested, and you have a use case. To enable that use case, you need to shape the data. You need to transform it, as in maybe you need to introduce some business logic. Maybe you need to clean it, harmonize it, maybe change data types. So it's very vague, very broad, because there's a lot that can happen during transformation. And the whole point of transforming it well is to know where to do what kind of transformation in your pipelines.
Okay, understood. So we're talking about every type of manipulation.
Yeah, correct.
So tell us, what are some of your hot takes when it comes to manipulating data?
So I think that the simpler, the better. Sometimes, especially in the data world, we like to create some sort of barrier to entry. We think that the more complex, the coolest it is. I don't think so. I think that if you're a data professional and no one knows what you're doing, no one can read your code because it's so complex, maybe you're not doing a good job. So that's where, again, the IKEA furniture comes in. It's like, can you make it accessible for everyone? At Xebia Data, we're very passionate in general about data democratization, especially the analytics engineering in the team. We even have a white paper about it, and I firmly believe in it. I think data is something that should be usable, accessible, available to, if not everyone, most people in the company. And simplicity is key in it.
Okay, so when everybody writes code, I think we're all working towards a certain constraint or goal. Sometimes it's like really like how long it takes to run. Sometimes it's like testing or whatever it is. What you're claiming is that for transformations, you fully advocate that readability and understanding the code is the most important criteria.
Yeah, I would say it's the first one. So I agree
Okay.
that optimization is important, but I would say it comes second. Because try to optimize a query when it's a big spaghetti bowl or like a huge query and you have to, select parts of it and just try and run them separately. That is so much more difficult than when it's already done properly. It's already easy to read. You already know what's doing what. And now you're thinking, okay, now I see that this part could be optimized. And maybe you want to have some clustering or partitioning in there. But first of all, that is a problem that might come indeed, but that where mainly most of the time the solution is actually going to be into adopting good practices in your transformations. And second, it will be a lot easier if it's already good written code.
Indeed. I personally love regular expressions, and I can see some beauty in complexity. But I think we can all agree, also the people listening, that in the current data landscape, probably the biggest threshold, the biggest bottleneck is the amount of people out there. We have a lot of people are just getting started, a lot of people getting up to speed in the data world, and every single thing we can do for them, it really pays off. I think if there were way too many senior data people in the world, maybe understandability would play a different role. But I guess in this data landscape, I have to fully agree with you.
Yeah, and if you think in terms of making your pipeline scalable, right, you want to have as many people as possible able to use them. So if you have this one very smart person who wrote all of it, but is the only one who can understand it, you're now completely dependent on this person. If they go on holiday, you cannot do anything about the pipeline. And that is something that is actually very
It's
common.
painfully common, yes.
It is painfully common. And I've been in that position where I was that person and I thought, oh, wow, I must be very special then. And then I learned that actually I wasn't. I was just writing poor code that no one could pick up. So yeah, it is. I think if you, again, like if you take the IKEA furniture, it is a piece of furniture that you're assembling, and it is the last and most crucial step of it, right? Because it's what's going to make it usable. Um, and no matter your skill set, basically, and no matter the tools you own at home, you can put it up because the instructions are so clear, because the engineers have thought through about the smallest but reusable components to make that furniture, so that you can actually do it. And I think that is beautiful. I think if I can achieve that in my transformation pipelines, then I will be happy.
Yes, but like you mentioned, it requires people to think, have empathy, document, simplify processes. I really think that being replaceable, like for your own data team, for whatever type of data job that you do, it's ironically very, very difficult. It is like you mentioned, because of you writing terrible code, or maybe because there are literally no other people to take over. It's very easy to be in that position where you're irreplaceable. And then that sounds nice in terms of job security, but that's also not an amazing strategy in the long term.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, not to be now doing a lot of too much advertising for Xavier, but I do think it is like a differentiating factor for us as consultants. We have, whenever we start a new project, we also have a mission to make ourselves obsolete. So to make sure that the client can pick up our work, and that means either through upskilling people while we're there or hiring new people. And we always make sure that that moment comes. And then maybe the client needs something else. Maybe we stay longer after that because there is still some need, but we don't try to stay just to stay, or we absolutely don't try to make ourselves irreplaceable. On the contrary, we try to, as early as possible, define a strategy so that the client can be autonomous.
For sure. And it might be a little bit more difficult for the sales team, but in reality, it's much nicer for the consultants. Like, we're happy, we see different environments, we learn. And for the clients, like, they're not vendor locked, so I can definitely see a lot of value in that. And I really like that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. It's more future proof as well. Yeah. It works better for everyone. It's a win-win.
Okay, so far we have talked a lot about readability, but I think I've also heard a glimpse of other things like modularity. Would you like to explain the next principle?
Yeah, so modularity is, and I've mentioned this, about having the smallest reusable components. So think of user-defined functions. Think of common table expressions. Think of anything that allows you to break down the complexity of your code in parts that you can reuse. So if my company is going to be converting regularly from dollars to euros, then I better write a user-defined function or have maybe a table of the conversion rates. And this piece of the work should be reusable across my pipelines. It could also mean layering your code. So if you're familiar with dbt and Databricks, you've heard terms like the medallion architecture, or having row and then staging and then intermediate and marts models. So this is now a very common and accepted method to make sure that you reuse parts of your transformations, and that the most reusable parts are very early in the logic. So maybe something that is purely business logic, very specific to a use case, you're going to keep at the very end of your pipelines and move logic that is going to be reused by a lot of stakeholders upstream in your pipelines. So that is another part, which is not exactly actually modularity, I realize, more about layers. And modularity can be done within queries or outside queries. So within queries, yeah, again, CTEs, UDFs, outside
DBT macros, Python
DBT
functions.
macros, Python functions, and actually talking about DBT as well, the ref function is a very good example of being able to reference another model. So you literally reuse the model, and it even allows you to create this directed acrylic graph where you can see very clearly like the lineage of your transformations. And if you did it well, it should look very layered, and you should be able to see
Yeah.
every step of the pipeline.
And you also mentioned reusability, but I would argue that there are a lot more benefits of working modularly. The first one would be it's much easier to test every individual module, macro, function, whatever you want to call it. Is much easier to test if you make them really small.
Mm-hmm.
And second is encapsulation. I know this is a hot take, but for example, when I work in DBT, if something has more than 3 lines of code, I immediately create a macro.
Yeah.
Even if I only use it once, just because having my macro somewhere else is going to make the main script much, much easier to read. And then I just don't have to fish for that logic anywhere.
Yeah, I agree. Everything should have a single purpose. So there's also a principle that's called, I think, single responsibility purpose, or the other way around. That basically says one thing does just one thing, and you cannot have suddenly I don't know, a macro that does two things at the same time. Then just break it down, create a second one, because then you can maybe reuse that first part or debug it more easily than if you put it all together and it's all mixed up.
However, I have to say it's also easier said than done, because if you think about it, I found myself in the situation where I create way too many functions. And then also, when you have something like SQL, very specifically SQL, you don't always have a input on how things are done.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some languages that are 100% declarative, like first go here, then do this, then and do it this way. Some languages that are the opposite, like do this and I don't care how you do it. SQL is a weird mix in between.
Yeah. So it's true that as a team, you often have to also think about how are we going to write code. And that's where also tools like DBT that allow you to peer review the code because it's all Git versioned. It allows you to have another pair of eyes that maybe comes in and says, hey, this works, but I would suggest doing it this way. And then maybe if those conversations occur a couple of times, maybe during your sprint retrospective, you can have a talk and say, hey, actually, I noticed that we regularly see this in the code, and this is my take on it. And maybe there needs to be a discussion around it. I've had clients where we decided at some point, after developing for some time together, to kind of take a break and see, okay, what are the habits that we all have?
Yeah.
And what do we like, what do we don't like? And we have to make a collective decision because we all have to use this code. So it's not just about me in my bedroom writing my piece of code. It's about me writing it for other people that are going to also use it. And I think being very critical, taking a very critical look at the code you write, just like when you write a book, you have to do some proofreading, proof editing. And you and I know how painful that is. Actually, when you write a book, editing is as much, if not more, effort than writing in the first place. And I believe it should be the same with code. Maybe you do a first, drop of what you think how you think you should be doing it, and then maybe you review it and think differently. And then with experience, it becomes easier to just get it right from the start. But I personally still sometimes don't know how I'm going to do something until I jot it down, and then that's where I improve it.
Yes, and there is also something that I would like to mention about my experience, and that is when the code is properly modularized and everything is broken down into small components, it is so much easier to give feedback on it because then you can test every single function, call it somewhere else. When you get some of those scripts that it's like everything runs or everything fails, it's very hard to give some really good feedback because you know that every little change and you change 3 lines here and then everything breaks and you're like, I shouldn't have bothered.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with you. It really helps when people are checking the code and giving suggestions.
Yeah, I agree. I've also been in that situation where I get a pull request and I look at it and I'm like, oh, I don't really feel like reviewing this amount of code right now. And it's too big. And you think, well, to test this and now to know whether it does what I think it does will take forever. And you're very much tempted to be like, you know what, I
Yes.
trust you. But that's just not a good strategy eventually.
Like a colleague used to say, I know exactly everything that is wrong with your script, but it will take me an eternity to write something better.